I can tell you guys my favorite joke, but it might take a little while. It's kind of a long joke. It's called the monk joke. I don't know if you guys have heard it. So Speeve works at the office and he hates it. So he travels to a monastery where there are monks at the monastery, living their monk life. But they're living their monk life, and in comes Steve, and he's wandering around the monastery. He's given a tour, and he walks past a room, and he hears this really strange noise on the other side of the door. And he turns to the person who's giving him his guide, and he's like, "Hey, what's behind that door? There's a funky noise back there. What's all that?" And the monk is like, "Oh, that we can't tell you that. You're not a monk, and that room. What happens there is it's monk stuff only, buddy. So I can't tell you." And the Speeve is like, "Okay, fair enough." And then he goes, and he meets the leader, the head monk. That's what the word was used when it was told to me. I don't know if that's actually what the appointed leadership figure is called, but you know, for the sake of this joke, we'll go with it. He talks to the head monk and he's like, "Oh, thank you so much for the tour." And he decides that this life is much cooler than this life is so much more epic, pog, cool than my office life, so I would want to stay here. And he does get to stay there, and he spends the next 50 or so odd years training and learning the craft. And then, those 50 years later, he comes back walking down, the halls of the monastery, and he passes that room again. And he hears the noise again, and he's like, "Oh, I remember. I remember this place. I need to know what's back there." And now I can know what's back there. So he goes to the leadership figure and he says, "Hey, can you tell me what's in that room now? I'm a monk, and I've done my wonderful training, and I would like to know what's back there." And the head monk says, "Well, actually, I think it would be much better if you went and saw it for yourself. It's a difficult thing to explain in words. It's like an emotional experience. So why don't you just go look?" And so he's like, "All right, thanks, brother." And anyway, he goes to the door and he tries it, and the door's locked. And he's like, "Oh, okay, I guess I need a key." And he goes back to the leadership figure and he's like, "Hello, that door you told me about, it's locked. I can't get in if the door's locked." And he's like, "Oh, my bad. I forgot that the doors are supposed to be locked at all times. Here's the key." And he reaches into his desk and he pulls out a iron key and he hands it to Speeve. He says, "Thanks, this is what you need. This'll get you there just fine, son." And he takes the key and he's like, "Awesome, man. Thank you so much." And he takes the key and he goes to the door and he can still hear the noise on the other side of it. And he's like, "Oh, man, I need to know so badly. I need to know what's behind that door." So he puts the key in the lock. It's a big old rusty lock, but it works. And he turns it, and the lock clicks open, and yeah, and then he opens the door, and there is a dark hallway on the other side. And then he steps into the darkness, and he hears the noise, and it's still somewhat faint, like something's in the way. And he reaches out his hand into the darkness, and it comes to rest against something wooden, and come to realize it's actually another door. And he looks at the door and he's like, "What? Why is there another door here? It's just a hallway and a door. That doesn't make any sense." But that's the situation. So he reaches down and he fiddles with the doorknob, and it doesn't wiggle. It's locked. He goes, "Ah, dang it. Looks like I need a key for this one too." And so he goes over to the head monk's office again. He walks back and he says, hey, there's a second door. That's weird. It's locked also. Do you have a key for that? And the head monk's like, oh, yes, sorry about that. And he goes into another drawer in a cabinet. And, you know, he looks through that and he says, yes, here it is. And he pulls out a large bronze key. And he gives the bronze key to Speeve. And he takes it and he's like, thank you. And the leadership figure is like, yeah, no problem. And so he goes back to the set of doors. And he realizes that by mysterious circumstance, the first door closed behind him. So he tugs on the doorknob and realizes that, yes, it's locked. And he doesn't have the key. In fact, he left the iron key at the desk, thinking he wouldn't need it again. So he goes back to the office and he's like, yeah, hey, sorry, I left one of the keys. And he picks it up and he goes back and he puts it in the iron lock. He twists it open, opens the door. It's all gravy. Then he walks into the darkness, finds the wooden door with the copper lock, and realizes that, oh yeah, I do need that copper key, which is in the head monk's office. So I have to go get that copper key. It's like, oh, that's so silly. I can't believe I did that. When I picked him up, I must have swapped him out. That's not right. The copper key, he goes back to the office and he gets the copper key and he's like, hey, this is really awkward, but I left the key. I left this here key. Not the other key, but this one, this copper key. And then he takes the copper key and he goes back to the door and he unlocks the copper lock. And he opens that door. And still on the other side of the door is darkness and a muffled sort of strange sound that he can't quite tell what it is, and it's just far off in the distance, and it's ominous, ominous, and it's spooky, and he needs to know. So he steps into the darkness and he keeps walking forward, and he keeps walking forward, and his hand is outstretched until it finally, his hand comes into contact with yet another solid surface, and it's very smooth. It's a very smooth, cold surface, almost like a stone wall. And he feels around the wall until he realizes that there is a hole in the wall in which something might be inserted, something like a key. And he goes, oh my goodness, not another door to be unlocked. And he's like, well, this sucks. I guess I have to go back to the office and I'll ask Guy. I'll ask our beloved leadership figure, what the hell's up with that? Why there's a stone door? Anyway, so he goes back to the office and he's like, hey man, why is there a stone door? That's a weird thing to have. And anyway, the leadership guy is like, yeah, it is a bit weird. But yeah, I do have the key. And so he actually moves from behind his desk and he pulls up one of the wooden floorboards. And there's a small box there. And he opens up the box and inside is an ornate stone key. And he gives the stone key to Speeve and he says, hey, take care of this. This is a very important key. And, you know, we only have one of them. So, like, please, like, do be careful with it. And so Speeve takes the key and he says, yes, sir, I will be so careful with this key. And he takes the key and he goes back. And by mysterious circumstances that you will never, ever have guessed, The iron locked door has closed itself and is once again locked. Speeve looks down at his belongings, and he's got a stone key and a copper key, and he puts the copper key into the iron lock and it doesn't work. And then he puts the stone key into the iron lock and it doesn't work, and he realizes that he has left the iron key in the office. So he goes to the office, he gets the iron key, and he goes back and he puts it in the lock. It opens, and he has gotten past the iron door. And then he goes through the darkness forward, feeling his hands around to make sure he doesn't trip or bump into anything. And he reaches the copper door, or the copper locked door. They're not made of copper. He fiddles around with the lock, and he looks at the keys he has. He's got an iron key, and he's got a stone key. So he puts the iron key in the copper lock, and he turns it, and it doesn't work. And he puts the stone key in the copper lock, and it doesn't work. And he's like, oh, balls, I don't have the copper key. And he goes all the way back to the office, and he picks up the copper key, and he thanks the beloved leadership figure. And then he goes back, and he unlocks the iron door, which has closed. And then he unlocks the copper door, which was closed. And so he unlocks the copper door, and he goes through, and he finds the stone door, and he places his fingers around to try and sort of find the keyhole. and he finds it, and then he tests his first key, which is the iron key, and it does not work on the stone door. And then he tests his second key, which is the copper key, and that also does not work on this stone door. And then he realizes that he doesn't have the stone key on him, the most important key of them all. And so he has to go back to the office, and the leadership figure says, hey, you need to be a little more careful with these keys. And he hands him a keychain. He hands him a keychain and says, you should put those keys on here. And so he puts the stone key and the iron key and the copper key on the keychain. And then he goes back and he goes through the process of unlocking the doors, which for some reason have been closing behind and locking themselves. Whether this is an intentional feature of the room is unknown to him. But he gets to the stone door and he inserts the lock, or the key, into the lock. There is no hinge. The stone starts to sort of slide, grating against the rest of the wall, and as it like sort of slides in, like slots away, and opens up to a pathway. Steve steps out into the darkness, and he almost falls because there's no ground in front of him. He almost falls into a great big hole, and he realizes that there is just more wall on the other side. And so Steve, confused, returns to the office and says, hey, there's a hole in the ground. There's just a hole in the ground. And the head monk is like, yes, that's intentional. And Speeve is like, well, why? The leadership figure, he's not really paying attention. He goes into a cupboard, and then he moves everything out of the way, and then pulls the back out of the cupboard, and gets a glistening silver rope, and gives it to Speeve, and says, this is a treasured artifact, so you need to watch over it. You need to take care of it. Don't lose this. But you're gonna need this to get down the hole. And Speeve is like, yes, sir, I will take amazing care of this rope. I'm so happy that you would entrust this to me. And he takes the rope, and he's so proud to have been entrusted with this sacred artifact. He takes it to the doors, and he looks down, and as per usual, the doors have closed. and he reaches down to where his keychain should be to unlock it, and he realizes that in his excitement he left the keychain in the office. So he goes back to go get it. So anyway, he goes back to get the keys, and he takes his keychain, and he's a little more wary now, and he goes back to the doors, and he slowly begins to unlock them one by one. The iron key on the iron lock, the copper key on the copper lock, the stone key on the stone lock, and then he looks down into the hole, and he gets the rope, and realizes that the rope is not with him. He runs back to the office, and he goes and he grabs the rope off the desk, and he's like, sorry. And before the leadership guy says anything, he's already booking it, and he goes back and he gets the rope, and he does the arduous process of undoing, you know, the locks and opening up all the doors, and then he ties off the rope to one end on a little iron hook that is sort of on the coming out of like the cave top ceiling or whatever you want to call it. It's not really a ceiling, but roof of the cave. And he ties the other end of the rope around himself, and then he descends into the hole. Anyway, he slowly descends into the darkness. When he finally reaches the bottom, his feet touch water, wet water, like wet. It's wet down there. And so he unties the rope from himself, and he descends into a pool of water. He begins to swim forward across to the other side of a small underground little lake area. And when he comes up to the shore, he moves forward, and there is, like, the noise now, it's super loud. Like, it's so loud. He can hear it. It's so strange and abhorrent and terrifying, and he realizes that he's finally made it to the source of the noise. But it's too dark for him to see anything, and he needs a flashlight. He swims across the water, climbs up the rope, goes through all of the doors, and then heads to the office and says, "Hey, I need a flashlight. If you could do that for me." And the leadership figure is like, "Yeah, I've got a flashlight." And he reaches into a drawer in his desk, and he pulls out a small flashlight, and he hands it to Speeve and says, "This is worthless. I don't care if you lose it." And Speeve is like, "Okay, boss." And he takes the flashlight, and he runs all the way back to the doors, which have, of course, you know this by now, have shut and locked themselves. Speeve, though, however, hasn't learned this lesson, because he left the ring of keys at the office, and he's like, oh shit, oh stinky. And he goes all the way back to the office, and he gets the ring of keys. And he goes back, and he starts unlocking the doors, and then he ties the ring of keys around his waist, like his belt buckle. And he's like, aha, now I won't lose these. He goes through the hallways and the doors, and he climbs down the rope, and he swims to the other side, and then, you know, he gets out of the water, he goes to click the flashlight on, and it doesn't work, because it wasn't waterproof, and he just sort of swam across a lot of water with it, so it stopped working, it didn't survive. And Speeve is like, oh shit, it broke. And so he's like, he has to go back to the office. He swims across the body of water, he climbs up the rope, he goes through the doors, he heads back to the office, and he's like, hey boss, I need a waterproof flashlight. And And our beloved leadership figure is like, well, I don't have one of those, but here's this Ziploc bag. So put your new flashlight in here, and he puts the new flashlight in the Ziploc bag. He's got the keys tied around his waist, and the rope is already tied up, so he's got all his things. He goes to the door. Iron locked. Unlocked with the iron key. Copper lock. Unlocked with the copper key. The stone door unlocked with the stone key. He descends the rope into the water, swimming across, pulling himself up, and then he opens the Ziploc bag to remove his flashlight, and he finally clicks it on to behold the strange, abhorrent thing that was making the noise. The reason for this journey ever taking place. He beholds it. And he sees I can't tell you, you're not a monk at the monastery.